Cleveland welcomed October with rain and cold winds from Lake Erie. The gray skyscrapers of the business district were lost in low clouds, and the wet streets reflected the neon signs of restaurants and bars. In one such establishment, the upscale Madison Bistro on the east side, 23-year-old Stephen Stewart was polishing glasses behind the bar. Stephen had that special charm that made people turn their heads. Tall, slender, with chestnut hair and piercing green eyes, he had a smile that made customers leave generous tips. But behind his good looks lay a calculating mind and a cold heart, though few noticed. "Another martini, Stephen," a regular customer called out to him, waving his hand from a corner table. Stephen nodded and began to prepare the cocktail, his movements precise and practiced. 3 years of working as a bartender had taught him not only how to mix drinks, but also how to read people, understand their desires and weaknesses. The Madison restaurant attracted a wealthy clientele, business people, lawyers, doctors. Stephen had long realized that this place offered him opportunities he never had as a child in the poor neighborhood of Cleveland Heights. He grew up without a father, with an alcoholic mother and an older sister, Anna, who was already taking care of the family like an adult at the age of 16. Anna became a nurse at Metro Health Hospital and rented a small apartment in the city center. She often called Stephen, worrying about his future and suggesting he go to college or find a more stable job. But Stephen didn't see the point in the traditional path to success. He believed in quick fixes and easy money. That evening, around 9 o'clock, a man Stephen had never seen before walked into the restaurant. He was about 50, with graying temples, an expensive suit, and a confident gait. The man sat down at the bar, ordered a whiskey and soda, and took out his phone, apparently checking his messages. "Tough day?" Stephen asked, handing him his drink. He always started with simple questions to put his customers at ease. The man looked up from his phone and smiled. "You could say that. Richard Blackwood," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "Stephen Stewart. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Blackwood." "Just Richard, please." The handshake was firm, but not overly enthusiastic. "First time here. A friend recommended this place." Stephen nodded, studying his new customer. An expensive Rolex watch, a perfectly tailored suit, Italian leather shoes. Everything about him spoke of considerable wealth. "What brings you to our neighborhood? Business?" "Mostly, yes. I have several restaurants in the city, and am considering opening a new establishment here on the east side." Richard took a sip of whiskey and looked around. "Nice atmosphere. Quality service. You can tell you have professionals working here." Stephen felt something stir inside him, not sympathy, but rather the interest of a hunter who had spotted his prey. "Thank you for the compliment. What kind of restaurants do you have?" "The Old River in Tremont, Cross Keys in Little Italy, and a couple of other places." Richard spoke without boasting, simply stating facts. "I started 20 years ago with a small cafe, and now it's a whole chain." Stephen was impressed, though he didn't show it. He continued wiping glasses, but listened intently to every word. "An impressive journey. You must have worked hard." "Yes, especially in the beginning. I practically lived in that first cafe." Richard smiled again, and Stephen noticed that the smile touched his eyes. "How long have you been working here?" 3 years. I like interacting with people, hearing new stories every night." Stephen leaned closer, creating a feeling of confidential conversation. "Although sometimes I think about something more, you know? Maybe my own business someday." "Ambition is good. The main thing is that it's realistic." Richard finished his whiskey and looked at his watch. "I have to go. I have an early meeting with my real estate agent tomorrow." "Of course. Hope to see you again." "I will be sure to. By the way," Richard took out his business card and placed it on the counter next to a generous tip. "If you're ever in the area of my restaurants, stop by. Always nice to see professionals." After he left, Stephen picked up the card and studied it carefully. Richard Blackwood, owner, Blackwood Hospitality Group. The office address was in the city center, along with a phone number and email address. The design was simple but expensive. Stephen spent the rest of the evening thinking. Richard Blackwood looked like a man who had achieved success through hard work, but there was a certain loneliness in his eyes. He didn't wear a wedding ring and didn't mention his family. These were important details for Stephen. The next day, he called his sister. "Anna, have you heard of Blackwood's restaurants?" "Of course. Who hasn't? They're expensive, high-quality establishments. Why?" "Just curious. The owner stopped by yesterday." "Stephen, I hope you're not planning anything foolish. Find a decent job. Go to college. You've got brains. Use them." Stephen smiled. Anna had always been too proper, too honest. She didn't understand that in this world, you had to seize opportunities when they presented themselves. A week later, Richard showed up at Madison again. This time he wasn't alone, but with a business partner, a tall man in his 30s who introduced himself as Jason Clark, a notary public. They discussed some documents, placing orders from time to time. Stephen watched them, noting the details. Richard was clearly the senior partner, making decisions, while Jason listened and took notes. The atmosphere between them was businesslike but friendly. When Jason left to take a phone call, Richard approached the counter. "How's it going, Stephen? How are your plans for your own business coming along?" "Just a dream for now. It's hard to raise capital when you're earning tips." Stephen said this with a hint of sadness, but without self-pity. "I understand. I went through that myself. I borrowed the initial capital for my cafe from all my friends." Richard paused for a moment. "By the way, I need a beverage consultant for my new place. Someone who understands what young people like, what cocktails are popular. Interested?" Stephen's heart beat faster, but he didn't show his excitement. "Sounds interesting. What does it involve?" "A couple of meetings a week, discussing the menu, maybe visiting other places to study the competition. Hourly pay plus expenses, $500 a week to start." $500 a week was more than Stephen made as a bartender in 2 weeks. "I'm interested. When can we start?" "Tomorrow if you like. I'll give you my number and we'll call and set up a meeting." When Richard left, Stephen felt a rush of excitement. Not because of the work itself, but because of the opportunities it opened up. Richard Blackwood was a wealthy, lonely man who was clearly looking for companionship. Stephen understood people like that and knew how to handle them. The first meeting took place on Thursday at Richard's office on the 23rd floor of the Key Tower in downtown Cleveland. Stephen had deliberately chosen his best suit, an inexpensive but well-fitting dark blue jacket with a white shirt. He wanted to look professional, but not pretentious. The office impressed him with its size and view of Lake Erie. The panoramic windows, expensive furniture, and paintings on the walls all spoke of serious success. Richard greeted him personally, which was unusual for a businessman of his caliber. "Impressive view," Stephen remarked as he approached the window. "Yes, especially at sunset. Sometimes I stay late just to watch it." Richard stood next to him, and Stephen caught a faint scent of expensive cologne. "Coffee? I have some excellent Arabica." "I'd love some." While Richard made coffee in the small kitchen area of the office, Stephen studied the surroundings. There were photos of restaurants on the desk, no family pictures. The bookshelves were filled with business books and cookbooks. On the side table were travel magazines, all featuring expensive destinations. "Tell me about your new project," Stephen asked, taking a cup. "I'm planning to open a cocktail bar in the warehouse district. Something modern, but not flashy. The target audience is young professionals, people with good incomes, but not necessarily millionaires." Richard sat down opposite him, crossing his legs. "The problem is, I don't understand their preferences. I'm 52. My tastes were formed a long time ago." Stephen nodded, putting on a serious face. "I understand the problem. Young people today aren't just looking for drinks. They're looking for experiences. Instagram culture, you know? A cocktail has to look good, and there has to be an interesting story behind it." They spent the next 2 hours discussing the concept for the bar, and Stephen showed himself in the best light. He offered creative ideas and talked about trends he had noticed at Madison. Richard listened attentively, asking questions, clearly impressed by the young man's knowledge and enthusiasm. "You must have studied business in college," Richard remarked. "I didn't have the opportunity. I had to start working early." Stephen said this without bitterness, simply stating a fact. "But Life is a good school too. I agree. Sometimes practical experience is more important than theoretical knowledge. As the meeting drew to a close, Richard took out an envelope. Your first payment. Let's meet next week at that cocktail bar on West 25th Street. We'll study the competition. Great idea. What day works for you? Friday evening? After 7. Stephen agreed and left with a sense of accomplishment. The $500 in his pocket felt good, but even better was the thought that the plan was starting to work. Richard was clearly interested in more than just his professional qualities. On Friday, they met at Speakeasy, a stylish bar with a Prohibition-era atmosphere. Richard was already waiting at a table in the corner, studying the cocktail menu. Sorry I'm late. Traffic, Stephen lied, even though he had arrived right on time. He knew that a little carelessness was sometimes more attractive than excessive punctuality. No problem. I've ordered a martini. What would you like? An old-fashioned, please. They spent the evening discussing the interior, the music, and the drinks. But Stephen noticed that Richard was increasingly steering the conversation toward personal topics, asking about his family, hobbies, and plans for the future. Stephen responded cautiously, creating the image of an ambitious but modest young man from a simple family. I have an older sister, Anna. She's a nurse, very caring. She always worries about me, Stephen said, pretending to be a little embarrassed by the attention. And your parents? My father was gone and my mother had a drinking problem. Anna basically raised me. Stephen said this quietly with a slight sadness in his voice. Richard nodded understandingly. That's tough, but you made it. You made something of yourself. I'm trying. I want to achieve something more, to make Anna proud. When the bill came, Richard insisted on paying. Business expenses, he explained. But Stephen noticed how his gaze lingered on him a little longer than usual. After the bar, they strolled along the waterfront, despite the November chill. The city lights reflected in the dark water of the lake, and Richard stopped at the railing. You know, Stephen, it's been a long time since I've enjoyed work this much. Usually business meetings are all boring reports and numbers. I enjoy working with you too. I feel like I have something valuable to offer. You definitely do. Richard turned to him. What are you doing tomorrow evening? Stephen sensed a change in the atmosphere. No plans. Why? I'd like to show you one of my restaurants. The Old River in Tremont. The food is amazing. Maybe we can get some ideas for the new bar. Sounds tempting. Great. Shall we meet there at 8? The next evening, Stephen arrived at the Old River and was amazed by the level of the establishment. It was a real fine dining restaurant with white tablecloths, professional waiters, and a wine list with 100 selections. Richard reserved a table in a private area overlooking the Cuyahoga River. Impressive, Stephen admitted honestly as he surveyed the interior. Thank you. This restaurant is my baby. I started with a simple cafe in this same building and gradually expanded. The dinner was exquisite. Oysters, salmon steak, expensive wine. Stephen tried not to show how unfamiliar such luxury was to him, eating neatly and keeping the conversation going. Richard talked about his career in business, the difficulties and successes. What about your personal life? Sorry for being nosy, but you never mentioned your family, Stephen asked cautiously. Richard paused, swirling his wine glass. I was married when I was younger. It didn't work out. Since then, I've been more focused on business. I understand. Work can really take up all your time. Yes, but sometimes you want to share your successes with someone, or just talk about something other than profits and losses. Stephen felt that the moment was right. He leaned in a little closer. You know, Richard, I really enjoy talking to you. It's not often you meet people who are genuinely interested in other people's opinions. The feeling is mutual, Stephen. You have a fresh perspective on things, and, he hesitated, you're an interesting conversationalist. After dinner, Richard insisted on driving Stephen home in his car, a new BMW sedan. They continued talking on the way, and Stephen noticed that Richard was glancing at him more and more often. Thank you for a wonderful evening, Stephen said as he got out of the car at his house in a less than prestigious neighborhood. Thank you. And Stephen? Yes? Maybe next week we could get together outside of work? Just have dinner, talk? Stephen smiled his most engaging smile. I'd love that. Over the next few weeks, their meetings became regular. Richard invited Stephen to expensive restaurants, theaters, and concerts. Each time he insisted on paying, explaining that it was a business expense or simply hospitality. Stephen played his part perfectly. He was grateful but not overly enthusiastic, showed an interest in culture, and asked intelligent questions. Most importantly, he skillfully measured his intimacy, letting Richard know that the attraction was mutual, but without rushing things. One evening, after a concert by the Cleveland Symphony Orchestra, they were sitting in the bar of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. Richard had drunk more than usual and was more open. "Stephen, I have something to tell you," he began, nervously twirling his glass. "I'm listening. Over the past few weeks, I've realized that you've become very important to me, not just as a consultant, but as..." He hesitated. "As a friend?" Stephen suggested gently. "More than a friend." Richard looked him in the eyes. "I know there's a difference in age and status between us, but..." Stephen reached out and touched his wrist. "Richard, age is just a number. As for status, to me, you're just an interesting, intelligent person I feel comfortable with." "Really? Really?" Stephen said it in a tone that made Richard believe every word. That night, they kissed for the first time in Stephen's car in front of his house. Richard was gentle and uncertain, as if afraid of scaring away something fragile. Stephen responded with carefully calculated passion, enough to convince Richard of his sincerity, but not too much. The next day, Richard sent flowers with a note. "Thank you for a wonderful evening. I can't wait to see you again." Stephen smiled as he read the note. The plan was working better than he had hoped. Richard was in love, and now all that remained was to use those feelings correctly. When the phone rang and Anna's number appeared on the screen, Stephen hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hi, sis." "Stephen, it's been a while. How are you? I heard you're working as a consultant." "Yes, everything's fine. It's an interesting job, good money." "And this businessman Blackwood? You've been mentioning him a lot lately." Stephen sensed caution in his sister's voice. "He's just a good employer. He values my opinion." "Stephen, please be careful. Don't do anything stupid." "What are you talking about?" "You know what I'm talking about. I can see how you've changed. New clothes, expensive restaurants. Just don't play with people." After talking to Anna, Stephen was left thinking. His sister had always been perceptive, but she didn't understand that in life, you had to be able to take advantage of opportunities. Richard was lonely, rich, and in love. The perfect combination for someone who knew how to play with people's feelings. By December, the relationship between Stephen and Richard had reached a new level. Stephen had practically moved into Richard's penthouse in downtown Cleveland, a luxurious apartment with panoramic windows and designer furniture worth millions of dollars. Officially, he was still working at Madison, but he showed up there less and less. "Why do you need this job?" Richard would say, hugging Stephen on the leather sofa in the living room. "I can provide you with everything you need." "I don't want to feel like a freeloader," Stephen would reply, playing the role of a modest young man with principles. "It's important to maintain independence." But in reality, he was already planning how to get the most out of the situation. Richard showered him with gifts: an expensive Cartier watch, suits from Hugo Boss, a Versace leather jacket worth $3,000. Stephen accepted each gift with gratitude, but without excessive enthusiasm, giving the impression that he valued the attention more than the material aspects. That evening, they had dinner at the Old River. Richard ordered a bottle of Dom Perignon French champagne for $500 to celebrate the first month of their relationship. "To us," Richard raised his glass, his eyes shining with happiness. "To us," Stephen replied, and his smile was so sincere that even he almost believed it. During dinner, Richard took out a small box from Tiffany & Company. "This is for you, just because you make me happy." Inside was a gold chain with a pendant, a stylized key encrusted with small diamonds. Such an item cost at least $5,000. "Richard, this is too expensive," Stephen began, but Richard interrupted him. "Nothing is too expensive for someone you love." The word love hung in the air. Richard said it for the first time, and Stephen saw the expectation of a response in his eyes. "I love you too," Stephen said quietly, and Richard's face lit up. The lie sounded so natural that Stephen was amazed at his own acting talent. Richard took his hand, and Stephen didn't pull it away, allowing himself to enjoy the moment of power over someone else's feelings. The following week, Stephen decided to raise the stakes. They were walking through the Beechwood Place shopping center when he stopped in front of a jewelry store window displaying expensive watches. "Beautiful," he remarked, looking at a Rolex Submariner worth $12,000. "Do you like them?" Richard asked. "Just beautiful. I could never afford something like that." Stephen said this without self-pity, simply stating a fact. The next day, a courier delivered a box containing the watch to Stephen with a note. "Because you deserve the best. Love, R." Stephen tried on the watches and looked at himself in the mirror. An expensive suit, a gold chain, a Rolex watch. He looked like a young millionaire. The feeling was intoxicating. But the real test of his acting skills came when Richard suggested he meet Jason Clark, his business partner. The meeting took place in Richard's office, and Stephen immediately sensed a wariness in the notary's behavior. "Stephen, I'm glad to finally meet you," Jason said, but his handshake was cold. "Richard has told me so much about you." "I hope it's all good," Stephen smiled. "Of course, he says you're an excellent beverage consultant." There was a hint of mockery in Jason's tone, and Stephen realized that this man could see right through him. But he didn't show his irritation, continuing to play the role of a modest young man. "I try to be helpful. Richard gave me a great opportunity." "Yes, he's a very generous man," Jason said, glancing meaningfully at the expensive watch on Stephen's wrist. Richard didn't notice the tension between them, but Stephen realized he had an enemy. After Jason left, he decided to take the initiative. "Your partner doesn't seem to like me very much," he remarked. "Jason? He's just cautious. He's protecting me like an older brother." Richard put his arm around Stephen. "He'll get used to you. The important thing is that I like you." But Stephen could see that the seeds of doubt had been sown. Jason would be watching him, and he needed to be more careful. Meanwhile, problems were mounting on another front. Anna was starting to ask more questions. She noticed the expensive clothes, the watch, the fact that Stephen had moved downtown. "Stephen, I need to talk to you," she said when they met at a cafe near the hospital where she worked. "About what?" "About your new life, about where you got the money for all this." Anna pointed to his Hugo Boss suit. "A consultant's salary doesn't cover expenses like that." Stephen prepared to lie. "Richard really values my work. He gives me bonuses and sometimes pays for lunch." "Stephen, I wasn't born yesterday. What's really going on between you two?" "We're seeing each other," Stephen admitted quietly. "He's a good man. He cares about me." Anna's face darkened. "How old is he?" 52. "My God, Stephen, he's over 50. He's a wealthy businessman and you're using him." "I'm not using anyone. We have real feelings for each other." "Real feelings?" Anna raised her voice. "Stephen, I've known you since childhood. You've never been in love with a man. What are you doing?" Stephen felt irritated. Anna had always been too principled, too honest. She didn't understand that life offers few opportunities to get rich, and that you have to seize them when they come along. People change. Feelings change. "Stephen, please stop this. Get a normal job. Date people your own age. Don't ruin this man's life." "And who's going to fix my life? Do you want me to spend the rest of my life washing dishes for peanuts? Better honest poverty than wealth built on deception." After talking to his sister, Stephen was annoyed and worried. Anna knew him too well, and if she started digging deeper, there could be trouble. He had to be more careful. That evening, he returned to Richard's penthouse in a gloomy mood. Richard noticed it right away. "What's wrong, dear? You look upset." Stephen decided to use the situation to his advantage. "I saw my sister. She's against our relationship." "Why?" "She says I'm using you, that there can't be any real feelings between us because of the age difference and our positions." Stephen said this with bitterness in his voice. Richard sat down next to him and put his arm around him. "Don't listen to her. Love knows no age or boundaries. We're right for each other, and that's what matters." But what if she's right? What if people really think I'm only with you for your money? Then those people don't know you like I do. Richard kissed him on the temple. You're a kind, intelligent, honest man. I can see it in your eyes. Stephen felt a pang of guilt, but quickly suppressed it. Richard had created this situation himself by falling in love with the first young man who came along. He was naive and lonely, and it wasn't Stephen's fault. Maybe we should be more careful in public, Stephen suggested. I don't want gossip to hurt your business. I don't care about gossip. I'm proud of our relationship. But Stephen noticed a shadow of doubt in Richard's eyes. Anna and Jason's words were starting to sink in, and that worried him. In January, Stephen decided to raise the bar even higher. They were having lunch at Cross Keys when he brought up the subject of the future. Richard, I've been thinking about starting my own business. A small bar, maybe. Great idea. How much startup capital do you need? I'm thinking $100,000 for initial expenses, rent, equipment, licenses. Richard didn't even blink. No problem. Consider it already yours. Richard, I can't accept that kind of money just like that. Why not? It's an investment in our future together. Besides, he took Stephen's hand, I want to offer you to move in with me officially. Sell your apartment and live with me. Stephen felt dizzy with success. $100,000 in full board and lodging exceeded his wildest expectations. That's a big step, he said, feigning excitement. I've never been so sure of anything. I love you, Stephen. I want us to be together. That night, Stephen lay next to Richard as he slept in a huge bed overlooking Cleveland at night, counting his blessings. In 3 months, he had received gifts worth about $30,000, and now he had another $100,000 for the business, plus full board. Not bad for a poor kid from Cleveland Heights. But deep down, Stephen knew he had gone too far. Richard was truly in love and was making plans for their future together. Sooner or later, the truth would come out, and then Stephen would have to face the consequences. For now, everything was going according to plan, and he had to take full advantage of the opportunity while he could. What would happen after that was a problem for the future. The next day, Jason Clark came to Richard for a serious talk. Stephen overheard their conversation as he was passing by the office. Richard, you're out of your mind. $100,000 to a guy you've known for 3 months? Jason, it's my business. It's our business. We're partners, and your decisions affect the company. This guy is leading you on. You don't know Stephen. I know guys like him. Handsome, young, unprincipled. They can spot a lonely rich man a mile away. Stephen clenched his fists but continued to listen. Enough! I won't let you talk about the man I love like that. Fine. But when he disappears with your money, don't say I didn't warn you. After that conversation, the relationship between Richard and Jason became tense. Richard defended Stephen, but Stephen could see that doubts were beginning to creep into his mind. The situation became more complicated when Anna decided to take more decisive action. She came to the old river and demanded to see Richard. Mr. Blackwood, we need to talk about my brother. Richard was surprised, but agreed to talk. They sat down in a private area of the restaurant, and Anna began her attack. How much money have you spent on Stephen? I'm sorry, but this concerns me because I know my brother. He's not what he pretends to be. What do you mean? Stephen has never been interested in men. He's only ever had girlfriends. He's playing with you. Richard turned pale. You're wrong. Mr. Blackwood, my brother can be very convincing when he wants something, but he's incapable of real love. He's using you. After Anna left, Richard was shaken. He came home that evening gloomy and silent. Stephen immediately realized that he had met with his sister. How are you? He asked cautiously. Your sister spoke to me today. Stephen felt a chill run down his spine. About what? About us. She thinks you're cheating on me. Stephen walked over to Richard and took his hands. And you believed her? I don't know what to think. Richard, look me in the eyes. Do you see any lies there? Richard looked into Stephen's green eyes, and Stephen turned on all his charm. Anna doesn't understand our relationship. She's used to protecting me, but sometimes she goes too far. But she said you've never been in a relationship with a man. So what? Can't you fall in love with a specific person, regardless of their gender? I fell in love with you, Richard. With your mind, your kindness, your strength. Richard wanted to believe, and Stephen could sense it. But the seeds of doubt had been sown, and they would begin to sprout. On a February morning, Cleveland was blanketed in snow. Richard stood at the window of his penthouse, watching the flakes slowly fall onto the city streets. Behind him, Stephen was making coffee on an expensive Italian coffee machine, but the atmosphere between them was tense. Something had changed over the past 2 weeks. Richard had become withdrawn, often lost in thought when he thought Stephen wasn't looking. The gifts had stopped, and romantic dinners had become a rarity. Stephen felt his perfect plan beginning to fall apart. "Richard, we need to talk," Stephen said, placing his coffee cup on the glass table. "About what?" Richard didn't turn away from the window. "About what's going on between us. You've changed." Richard finally turned around. His face showed the exhaustion of someone who had been struggling with inner conflicts for a long time. "Stephen, I have something to tell you." Stephen's heart skipped a beat, but he remained calm. "I'm listening." Jason did some digging. "About your past." Stephen felt the blood drain from his face, but he continued to look at Richard with innocent bewilderment. "What kind of investigation?" "He hired a private investigator. He found out about your previous relationships." Richard sat down in the chair opposite him. "It turns out you've never had a serious relationship with a man. Only girls. So what?" Stephen tried his best to appear calm. "Don't I have the right to change my preferences?" "It's not just that. The detective found one of your ex-girlfriends, Carol Davis. She told him some interesting things about your character." Stephen remembered Carol, a girl from a wealthy family he had dated 2 years ago. The relationship ended when she realized he was only with her for access to her father's money. She was smart and perceptive, and if she had spoken to the detective— "What exactly did she say?" Stephen asked, his voice growing colder. "That you're a master manipulator, that you know how to make people fall in love with you and then use their feelings." Richard looked Stephen straight in the eye. "She said you're incapable of real love." Stephen realized the game was over. He could no longer pretend to be confused and hurt. The mask was starting to slip, and he decided not to waste his energy trying to keep it on. "And what are you going to do with this information?" he asked, a steely tone creeping into his voice. Richard noticed the change in Stephen's tone and expression. The young man who had seemed confused a minute ago was now looking at him with cold, calculating eyes. "I want you to leave," Richard said quietly. "Pack your things and go." "What about the 100,000 for the business? What about our plans?" Stephen stood up, his voice threatening. "There will be no money, and there are no plans." Richard stood up too. "I was a fool, but now I understand." "You don't understand anything." Stephen took a step closer. "You think you can just throw me away like a used toy?" "That's exactly what you've been doing to me for the last few months." Stephen's face contorted with rage. All his plans, all the months of careful scheming were crumbling in an instant. "It's all your fault. You were lonely and naive, and I gave you what you wanted. You gave me lies. I gave you the illusion of love you never had, and you were happy." Stephen was almost shouting now. "And now you want to ruin everything because of some gossip?" Richard shook his head. "Go away, Stephen, before I call security." "Security?" Stephen laughed, but his laughter was cold and angry. "Have you forgotten that I have the keys to your restaurants, access to your accounts, and your passwords? You think I'm just going to walk away empty-handed?" "What do you mean?" "I can destroy your business with one call to the tax office, or tell the whole town how you bought a young man's love. How will that affect your reputation?" Richard turned pale. "You wouldn't dare." "I dare. I have recordings of our conversations, photos of gifts, bank transfers. It all looks very compromising." "You recorded our conversations?" "I recorded everything, from the very beginning." Stephen took out his phone and showed Richard a list of audio files. "Insurance, you understand? In case you decide to get rid of me." Richard felt the world crumbling around him. The man he loved, the man he trusted, turned out to be a cold-blooded blackmailer. "How much?" he asked wearily. How much what? How much money do you want to disappear from my life? Stephen smiled a predatory smile. $1 million? You're out of your mind. It's a fair price for a few months of happiness, and for my silence. Richard walked over to his desk and took a checkbook out of a drawer. Fine, $1 million. But after that, you disappear forever. Stephen watched Richard write the check and felt the triumph of victory. The plan had worked even better than he had hoped. $1 million meant freedom, a new life. But when Richard handed him the check, something unexpected happened. You know what? Richard said, stopping halfway. No, I'm not going to pay you. What? I said I won't pay you. Do whatever you want. Tell everyone. I won't give you a penny. Stephen couldn't believe his ears. Don't you understand what I can do to your life? I do, but I won't live under the threat of blackmail. Richard tore the check in half. If you ruin my reputation, I'll survive, but I can't live knowing I paid you $1 million. Stephen stared at the pieces of paper in Richard's hands and felt rage flooding his mind. All his plans, all his dreams of an easy life, everything was falling apart right now. You'll regret this, he said through clenched teeth. Maybe, but not more than I regret the day I met you. Something broke inside Stephen. Months of careful planning, acting, humiliating pretense. It was all for nothing. He felt cheated, even though he was the cheater. Richard had dared to destroy his perfect plan, and that was unforgivable. Stephen looked around the room and saw a heavy bronze statuette on the mantelpiece, an award from some restaurant competition. Without thinking about the consequences, he grabbed it and swung it at Richard. Stephen, what are you doing? Richard didn't have time to finish his sentence. The blow landed on his temple. Richard staggered and fell, hitting his head on the edge of a glass table. There was a dull crack, and a pool of blood spread across the floor. Stephen stood over the body, breathing heavily. The statuette was still in his hand, glistening with drops of blood. Richard didn't move. His eyes were open, but there was no life in them. For the first few seconds, Stephen felt only satisfaction. Richard got what he deserved for ruining his plans, but gradually the reality of what had happened began to sink in. He had killed a man. Panic washed over him. Stephen threw the statuette away and stepped back from the body. Thoughts raced through his head, preventing him from concentrating. What should he do? How could he explain? Would someone come? He tried to pull himself together. He had to think logically. Should he call the police and tell them the truth? But then the story of their relationship would come out. The blackmail, the motive for the murder. He would be sentenced to life in prison. Run! But where? He had no money, no connections, no place to hide. Besides, he was the last person to see Richard alive. They would find him. Stephen looked at his watch. It was almost 10 in the morning. Jason was supposed to arrive at 11 for a business meeting. He had an hour to come up with a plan. He tried to imagine what had happened as an accident. Richard had slipped, fallen, and hit his head. But the statue with traces of blood told a different story. It had to be removed. Stephen went to the kitchen, took some rubber gloves, and carefully wiped the figurine, then put it back on the mantelpiece. Then he tried to wipe the blood off the floor, but there was too much of it. At some point, he realized that he was trying to hide the obvious. Richard had been killed, and sooner or later it would become clear. But he could try to divert suspicion elsewhere. Stephen began searching the apartment, making it look like a robbery. He opened the safe. He knew the combination. Took the cash and some valuables. He turned over several drawers and scattered papers around. But deep down, he knew these attempts were useless. Too many people knew about their relationship. Too many witnesses had seen them together. Jason, Anna, the private detective, they would all point to him as the prime suspect. Stephen looked at Richard's dead face and felt a strange emptiness. Months of living with this man, of pretense and manipulation, and it had all ended like this. Richard had truly loved him in his own way and had died because of that love. But there were no regrets, only fear and anger that his plans had failed. At 10:45, Stephen heard the doorbell ring. It was Jason, arriving early for their meeting. Stephen realized that the moment of truth had come. He opened the door, trying to look calm. "Jason, something happened to Richard. It looks like he fell and hit his head." Jason ran into the living room and froze when he saw his partner's body lying in a pool of blood. "My God! What happened here?" "I don't know. I came home half an hour ago, and he was already lying there. He must have slipped and fallen." Jason looked at Steven suspiciously. "Did you call an ambulance? The police?" "I was in shock. I've never seen a dead person before." "This doesn't look like an accident," Jason said, carefully examining the scene. "There's too much blood, and these things are all turned over." He took out his phone and called the police. Steven realized that his story had been implausible from the start. Jason was too smart to believe in an accident. While they waited for the police to arrive, Jason asked questions, and Steven realized that every answer only deepened his suspicions. The story was becoming increasingly convoluted and implausible. When the detectives entered the apartment, the first thing Jason did was tell them about the relationship between Richard and Steven, about his suspicions regarding the young man's motives, and about Richard's plans to end the relationship. Steven watched his last chance for salvation crumble and realized that the game was finally over. He had killed the only person who loved him, and now he had to answer for it. Detective Michael Torres arrived at the scene 20 minutes after the call. A 48-year-old veteran of the Cleveland Police Department, he had investigated hundreds of murders and knew at first glance that this was no accidental death. "What do we have?" he asked the first officer on the scene. "The victim is Richard Blackwood, 52 years old, owner of a restaurant chain. The body was discovered by his business partner, Jason Clark, who was with a young man named Steven Stewart, who claims to have found the victim already dead." Torres examined the body and the crime scene. Richard Blackwood lay by a glass table in a pool of blood, with a deep lacerated wound to his head. The room was in disarray, with drawers open, papers scattered, and an empty safe. "Looks like a robbery murder," remarked the junior detective. "Maybe," Torres replied, but his experienced eye noticed inconsistencies. "Or maybe someone wants it to look like a robbery." He approached Steven, who was sitting in the corner of the living room, pretending to be shocked and confused. The young man was well-dressed with an expensive Rolex watch glinting on his wrist. "Mr. Stewart, tell me what happened." Steven looked up, and Torres saw not grief but caution in his eyes. "I arrived around 10 this morning. We had an appointment to discuss business. The door was open. I went in and found Richard on the floor." "The door was open?" "Yes, unlocked. I thought he left it open for me." "And you didn't call an ambulance right away?" Steven paused for a second too long. "I was confused. I'd never seen anything like it." Torres wrote down the answer, mentally noting the pause. "What was your relationship with Mr. Blackwood?" "He was my employer. I was consulting him on drinks for a new bar." At that moment, Jason Clark interjected. "Detective, that's not true. They had a personal relationship, a very close one." Steven shot Jason a dirty look. "That's irrelevant." "It's not," Torres said firmly. "Go on, Mr. Clark." "Richard had been seeing this young man for the last few months. He spent a lot of money on him. Gifts, dinners, promised him $100,000 to open the bar." Jason spoke clearly and convincingly. "But recently, we learned the truth about Mr. Stewart's motives." "What truth?" "That he was using Richard for money. We have a private investigator's report on his past. He's done this kind of thing before." Torres turned to Steven. "Is that true?" "There were real feelings between us," Steven said, but his voice sounded less confident. "Real enough that you recorded your conversations?" Jason took the tape recorder out of his pocket. "Richard showed me this yesterday. He said Steven was blackmailing him with these recordings." Steven's face turned pale. He hadn't expected Richard to tell Jason about the blackmail. Torres took the recorder and played the last recording. Steven's voice sounded cold and demanding. $1 million. That's a fair price for a few months of happiness, and for my silence." Then Richard's voice. "You're crazy. It's a fair price." Torres turned off the recording and looked at Steven. $1 million for what exactly? Steven realized there was no point in lying anymore. Too much evidence pointed to him. "It was a misunderstanding. We had a fight, but I didn't kill anyone. Tell me about your argument. Richard believed the rumors and decided to end our relationship. I was upset, maybe I said something harsh, but then I left. When I came back in the morning, he was already dead. You left and then came back? Torres caught the contradiction. Earlier, you said you came at 10 for a business meeting. Stephen realized his mistake. I meant to say, Mr. Stewart, do you have an alibi for the time between 9 last night and 10 this morning? I was at home, alone. No one can confirm that. No, but Torres signaled to the technicians to begin collecting evidence. Mr. Stewart, you are under arrest on suspicion of murder. While Stephen was being read his rights, Anna arrived. She had heard about Richard's death on the news and immediately realized that her brother might be involved. Stephen! She cried when she saw him being led away in handcuffs. Stephen looked at his sister, and for the first time in all this time, there was something like remorse in his eyes. Anna, Shut up, she said sharply. Don't say anything without a lawyer. At the police station, Stephen was placed in a holding cell. For the first day, he stubbornly denied his guilt, claiming he was a victim of circumstances. But the evidence against him was mounting. The medical examiner determined that Richard had died from a blow to the head with a blunt object at around 9 p.m. the previous day. Microscopic traces of the victim's blood and hair were found on a bronze statuette on the mantelpiece, despite attempts to wipe them off. What's more, CCTV cameras in the building recorded Stephen leaving the penthouse at 9:30 p.m., not in the morning as he claimed. Records of his phone calls showed that he had called Richard several times during the evening, but Richard did not answer. On the third day of the investigation, Anna came to see Stephen. Stephen, stop lying, I know what you did. Stephen looked at his sister through the protective glass. Do you think I'm a murderer too? I think you've gone too far in your games, and now a man is dead. Stephen was silent for a few minutes, then said quietly, It was an accident. We had an argument. I got angry. Tell me the truth, the whole truth. And Stephen told her. He told her how he had planned from the beginning to take advantage of Richard's loneliness. He told her about the recordings of their conversations, the blackmail, the demand for $1 million. He told her how blinded he was by rage when Richard refused to pay. I didn't want to kill him, he said. I just wanted him to pay for the happiness I gave him. What happiness, Stephen? You lied to him every day. But he was happy. He thought he was loved. He felt young and needed. Isn't that worth something? Anna shook her head. You still don't understand what you've done. You ruined a good man's life and killed him. After talking to his sister, Stephen finally realized the gravity of his actions. Not morally, he still felt no real remorse, but practically, his life was over. The next day, he made a full confession to Detective Torres. It started out as a simple plan to make some money, Stephen said. I saw a lonely, wealthy man and decided to take advantage of the situation. Did you plan the murder from the beginning? No. I just wanted to get the money and disappear. Murder was not part of my plan. But you recorded the conversations for blackmail. It was insurance. I was afraid he might get rid of me without compensation. Torres studied Stephen's face, trying to see if there was even a hint of remorse for the man's death. How do you feel about Mr. Blackwood's death? Stephen paused. I'm sorry it turned out that way. He was a decent man, just naive. Is that all? What else? He's not coming back. Torres realized that he was dealing with a sociopath incapable of genuine remorse. Even now, Richard was nothing more than a source of money that had ceased to function. The trial of Stephen Stewart began 6 months later. The case received widespread coverage in the local media. The story of a young man who killed his elderly lover for money attracted the public's attention. Stephen's lawyer tried to present the case as a crime of passion, but the evidence was too clear. The blackmail recordings, attempts to stage a robbery, and lies to investigators all pointed to cold calculation. Jason Clark testified about how Richard had suffered in the last weeks of his life, torn between love and suspicion. He really loved this young man, he said, and that love killed him. Anna also spoke in court, describing her brother's character. Stephen was always selfish, she admitted, tears in her eyes. But I never thought he was capable of murder. The sentence was predictable. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Stephen listened without emotion, as if it were not his fate being pronounced. After the trial, Anna visited her brother in prison for the last time. "I won't be coming back," she said. "You died to me the day you killed Richard." "I understand," Stephen replied indifferently. "Take care of yourself, little sister." As Anna was leaving, he called after her. "You know what's strange? I almost believed that I really loved him. He was a good actor." Anna didn't turn around. Detective Torres closed the case with a sense of duty fulfilled, but without satisfaction. Crimes like this always left a bad taste in his mouth. When the victim was a person whose only fault was his willingness to love. Richard Blackwood's restaurants were sold, and the proceeds were donated to a charity for lonely elderly people. Simple words were engraved on his gravestone: loved and betrayed. Stephen Stewart spent his first months in prison thinking about how everything had gone wrong. He did not regret Richard's death. He only regretted not getting the money. In his cold mind, the plan still seemed perfect. It was just the execution that had failed.